Welcome to today's program, Mourning Remains, the fourth in a series of panels titled In Their Presence, Debates on the Dignity, Display, and Ownership of Human Remains. This project is a collaboration between the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life and the World Peace Foundation, both at Tufts University. I am Diane O'Donoghue, the director of the program for Public Humanities at Tisch College, here with my colleague Bridget Conley, Research Director of the World Peace Foundation and Associate Professor of Research at the Fletcher School. And in a moment, she will introduce today's speakers and our format. But let us begin with a land acknowledgement. Tufts University's Medford campus is located on Wampanoag, and Massachusetts traditional territory. Tufts Walnut Hill was once one of the hills in a slaveholding estate called 10 Hills Plantation. Both African and Native American persons were enslaved here in the colony of Massachusetts. It is especially fitting to begin today's panel with these words, making visible the lives, the losses, and the suffering that too easily can be erased or appropriated by sanctioned violence, a theme that has been addressed in our project from the start. But there's also been a powerful affective thread that is woven through our speakers' presentations and many attendees' questions in our preceding three panels. And today we will address directly the potential agency and emotion of acts of acknowledging death, loss, and the desire for connection. Our title, Mourning Remains, actually has two meanings: the act of grieving those who have been lost, murdered, disappeared, but also what is carried forward, mourning that remains to be done, is being done. Today we have two presenters who will bring their experiences to this essential, but too often denied act of remembering and honoring persons who lost their lives, but this does not mean that their lives are lost to memory or to mourning. And now Bridget will introduce our speakers.
So good morning or afternoon, everyone. And on the note of time and afternoons and mornings, Julia Vibach may be joining us a little bit later. This was a mistake Diane and I made as we were double checking the times across multiple zones so that we could invite as widely as possible. And I think we made a little bit of a mistake with the time change in the US on Sunday. So Julia will be joining us a little bit later. That gives us ample time, though, to really engage deeply with the profound and highly knowledgeable work of Dr. Isaias Rojas-Perez. He's an associate professor of anthropology at Rutgers-Newark. His research interests include social and cultural theory, and he focuses on sovereignty, governmentality, violence, rights, time and memory, the politics of materiality, and the ritualization of death in Andean Peru. And I have a feeling we're going to see how he weaves these threads together in today's presentation. His research interests draw on long-term work that he has done as a professional human rights activist in Peru during the armed conflict between the Peruvian military and the Maoist Shining Path, as well as several years of field work in the former war-torn areas of rural Andean Peru. His book, Mourning Remains, which obviously inspired our title, So it's Mourning Remains, State Atrocity, Exhumations, and Governing the Disappeared and Perused Post-War Andes. Came out from Stanford in 2018. The book examines attempts to find, recover, and identify the bodies of the disappeared during the 1980s and 1990s insurgency campaign in Peru's central southern Andes. It is with great pleasure that we welcome him to the conversations we've been having. So, Isaias, if I can.
Okay, thank you very much, Diane and Bridget. I will share my PowerPoint. See. Okay, again, thank you very much, Diane and Bridget, for your invitation to be part of this seminar in their presence. What I will try to do this morning is to share with you some ideas I have been working on for a while in terms of how is it that anthropology might bear witness to these events of mass atrocity and the subsequent attempts of mourning precisely these events of mass atrocities. So these are, I am anthropologist, and as such, I am taking these ideas as a kinds of field notes, if you will, meaning that they are not, entirely, elaborated and completed yet, but they are kind, of, again, works in ideas in progress. Okay, so an enlarged identity card photo of a boy wearing his school uniform alongside one of his class notebooks are among the artifacts displayed at the Museo de la Memoria, a small museum, a group of Quechua mothers of the disappeared built in Ayacucho, Peru. The notebook displays what could be the work of any Andean boy in a Spanish-speaking institution, such as the school. Unsteady lettering, misspellings, grammatical errors, playful drawings, etc. It is the work of any schoolboy preparing to enter into adult society by mastering the state's writing and reading practices. But at midnight on June 24 of 1984, a military squad kidnapped him from home. He was never seen again. Yet his handwriting remains, a material trace of a striving his disappearance halted. Pablo Gerardo Albites Pariona is one of the thousands of disappeared people during Peru's counterinsurgency campaign of the 1980s and 1990s. In this talk, I look at how handwriting, by its potential for embodying the disappeared, has emerged in aftermath of mass violence as a subaltern means for indicting state terror and disrupting state-sponsored projects of governing the aftermath. As anthropologist, I ask how anthropology might draw inspiration from such uses of handwriting to rethink its own task of giving textual body to the disappeared, writing memory and the aftermath not as a gesture of destroying official stories, but of subverting them from within. Handwriting differs from the state's writing practices through its unevenness, contingency, singularity, and fleeting temporality. If so, then I ask, what kind of political community handwriting reclaims in times when distinctions between conflict and post-conflict are ambiguous, if not inexistent? Pablo Gerardo is one of the thousands of cases that various state-sponsored initiatives have aimed at clarifying since 2001, when a caretaker government initiated a broad transitional justice project in Peru following the collapse of Alberto Fujimori's regime in late 2000. One of these initiatives has consisted in building an official archive of disappearances. This effort began with the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, CVR, which at the end of its mandate in August of 2003, compiled a preliminary list of 4,000 disappeared people. In 2016, the Peruvian government passed the law 3470, titled Ley de Búsqueda de Personas Desaparecidas, law for the search of disappeared people. This law had the purpose of facilitating the humanitarian search for people disappeared during the internal war between 1980 and 2000. In April of 2018, an office of the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights created by this law reported that at least 20,000 Peruvians were disappeared during this period. This has been so far the most comprehensive attempt to build an official database that reconciles and centralizes information from different official and non-official sources. The forensic exhumation of clandestine mass graves has been a second initiative aiming at casting light on the whereabouts of the disappeared. This component of the transitional justice project started with the aim of collecting evidence to prosecute human rights violations of the past and return the victims' remains to their relatives for proper burial. After the 2016 law, the purpose of these interventions has become primarily humanitarian rather than legal. Yet recovering the disappeared through exhumations has proven to be a daunting task. In late 2016, the United Nations Working Group on Enforced Involuntary Disappearance reported that between 2002 and January 2016, a total of 3,410 bodies had been recovered. Of these, about 2,000 were identified, but only half of them belonged to disappeared people, properly speaking. These results illustrate the complexity of the problem. Recovering human remains from clandestine mass graves scattered throughout the formidable Andean landscape is an overwhelming task. But a major problem is that in most cases, the victims' bodies were shattered beyond recognition, making their post-mortem individualization and identification almost impossible. One such a case concerns the military fortress of Los Cabitos, the regional headquarters of the counterinsurgency in Peru's central southern Andes. The CVR concluded that this fortress, located in the Andean city of Ayacucho, had been a major center of detention, torture, and disappearance of suspected terrorists during Peru's war on terror. I tell this story in my book, Mourning Remains, State Atrocity, Exhumations, and Governing the Disappeared in Peru's Post-War Andes. In 2009, at the end of 6 years of forensic investigation at the fortress' former training and shooting field, the public prosecutor's office uncovered dozens of mass graves containing the remains of an undetermined number of victims. The forensic experts unearthed 109 bodies, about half of them complete skeletons and the rest partial remains, along with an immeasurable quantity of ashes and burned fragments of human bones. The authorities also uncovered the foundations of furnaces where the bodies of the victims had presumably been incinerated. Few victims have been identified and returned to their relatives. The unidentified remains remain stored in cabinets in the premises of the legal and forensic institutions, while the event of state atrocity was inscribed in expert texts that are now shelved in forensic and legal archives. The realm of discourse is a third area of state-sponsored intervention relating to the disappeared. To that effect, a truth commission was appointed in mid-2001. The Sever did not narrowly focus on the disappear as its Argentinian counterpart did in the early 1980s. Rather, its task was to produce a narrative about the process, facts, and responsibilities of terrorist violence and human rights violations, with the purpose of guaranteeing the right of the society to know the truth. The Sever released its final report on August 2018 of 2003. One of its major conclusions was that over 69,000 people had died as a result of the 20-year war between the Peruvian military and two guerrilla groups, the Shining Path and the MRTA. Such a figure, the Sever said, meant that Peru had suffered more deaths during this episode of violence than in all the wars fought since independence from colonial rule in 1821. More disturbingly, of the total number of victims, 79% lived in rural areas and 75% spoke Quechua or other native languages as their mother tongue. In the context of a national population in which only 16% speak these native languages and only 29% live in rural areas, these figures are indeed salient. As for educational level, although more than 60% of Peruvians have obtained a high school degree, nearly 70% of the victims had only primary education. In addition to distributing victimhood, this epidemiology of violence helped the CBR to distribute moral and political responsibilities. For the CBR, the Shining Path was responsible for 54% of the deaths and accused the Maoists of having committed crimes against humanity and of attempting to incite genocide by provoking the state. The CBR also concluded that, I quote, at some places and moments in the conflict, the response of the armed forces to the insurgency entailed not only individual excesses, but also generalized and or systematic practices of human rights violations that constituted crimes against humanity. Finally, for the CBR, responsibility lay not only with the direct perpetrators of atrocity, but with Peruvian society at large. The war's episode of violence in Mother Peru had to be understood not just as the result of the political will of terrorist groups, but ultimately as a product of persisting unjust structural conditions in Peruvian society. The racism, economic inequality, and social and cultural discrimination that continue to structure Peru's social order made some Peruvians more killable than others. The release of the CBR's final report marked an inflection in the recent history of violence in Peru. In more than 20 years, no official attempt had been made to establish the truth of this event, to learn from experience and to draw lessons for the country's future. Yet not everybody accepted the CBR's conclusions, even though they forthrightly condemned the Shining Path for its violence. Among the ruling elites, some have recirculated forms of negationism to justify state violence in the name of defending democracy against the terrorist aggression. Others, like the Peruvian military, went beyond plain denial and released their own report in 2004 under the title En honor a la verdad, honoring the truth, attempting to reshape the CBR's narrative. By contrast, survivors, human rights groups, and other liberal sectors have claimed the CBR's final report as their own. No academic text reflecting on Peru's internal war fails to refer to this report, to the CBR's report. And it is now a source of textual authority in the criminal prosecution of human rights violations. More tellingly, every year, groups of Peruvians gather on August 28th to commemorate its release. It is an annual commemoration of the birth of an official text, one that makes claims of truth concerning a historical episode of mass violence that affected mostly illiterate people. It is as if events of violence are less commemorated than their entrance in the written text is. This polarized controversy around the Severus final report reveals struggles to control what Gordon calls the archive of statements, that is, to define what can be said or not about violence and mass death according to the system of enunciation operative in the ongoing regime of power. But how to explain the centrality of the written text in these struggles? I will just bullet point some of the presuppositions at work here. First, it is the long-standing cultural form that connects the written text with truth, the community, and the authority to interpret the text. Second, as an officially appointed body of inquiry, the final report is a truth with symbolic capital. Third, the release of the report sanctions that moment in which languages of human rights, trauma talk, or cultural humanitarianism are officially adopted to talk about past violence. Fourth, the release of the final report symbolically introduces a caesura in historical time, sanctioning a distinction between the illiberal violence of the past and the promise of the present and future of liberal rule. In that sense, it sanctions the temporality of the aftermath. Seen from this, from the perspective of never again, the final report embodies a normative force, an outness that emerges from a claim to political community made via a discourse of post-conflict nation building. This discourse presupposes a moral agreement about the past, presents the nation as a singular historical subject, and establishes its grid of intelligibility in terms of rights, recognition, and the rule of law. And today, I emphasize for this talk that this discourse is anchored to the written text, which in turn presupposes a literate audience comprised of citizens endowed with the cultural and symbolic capital necessary to participate in the democratic conversation, is delivered through a particular rhetoric, and is articulated in a majoritarian language. Echoing Deleuze and Guattari, I understand majoritarian here not in terms of numbers or identity, but in terms of what has achieved to impose itself as a model, as a parameter of normality, as a constant mode of existence that transcends its conscious plane of theoretical analysis. A majoritarian perspective refers to a state of domination, a standard in the world against which everything else is to be judged. In this case, it is notions of human rights, trauma talk, concepts of the nation, democracy, the state, or the law, which typically appear in these final reports as given. There is another way of writing the truth of violence that, echoing again Deleuze and Guattari, I call minoritarian writing. Minoritarian refers not to numbers or distinctions of scale or identity, but to variation, to escape from the subjection to the majoritarian. It refers to a composition of things, to a variation in the collective assemblage of enunciation. In that sense, it is not about finding a language uncontaminated by a state language or opposing sentiments to rationality, but rather it is about a different composition of things, affects, matter, and words. The Museo de la Memoria in Ayacucho, Peru, offers an illustration of this mode of composition. The Quechua Mothers of the Disappeared inaugurated this small museum in 2005, that is to say 2 years after the release of the Severus final report and the beginning of forensic exhumations of mass graves. This was thus the temporality of the aftermath. It was no longer for these mothers the time when the sovereign disappears the bodies of the enemy with a snap of the fingers, but the time when the sovereign recovers those bodies, counts, examines, identifies, and returns them to their relatives for proper burial. The dilemma for these mothers is thus no longer whether to obey the sovereign's law, as in the times of terror, but how to make the presence of their disappeared tangible in the present when state interventions are still unable to fulfill the promise of their return. In this sense, the first thing to observe is that the museum is not a display of a past that is somehow completed as in a classical display. Rather, the museum is part of their ongoing search for their disappeared children that the official institutions of the state have not been able to cancel. It is what Alberti calls an archive of pain, which continues interpellating the state with the question, ¿Dónde están? Where are they? In other words, the task of the Mother's Museum is the task of truth-telling rather than truth-making. Second, in the museum, there is also a written text about violence, but this text does not deny, nor does it parrot the official story. Rather, it makes selective use of fragments and quotes from the Severus final report evidentiary aspects to distinctively assemble and tell a story of collective suffering and resilience that contrasts with the portrayal of their victimhood that the state's official story seeks to emphasize. More poignantly, in contrast to the Severus abstract historiography that tells the story of the nation's wounded body, or the disembodied character of other state archives concerned with the disappeared, the Mother's Museum emphasizes effectively personal stories and the bodily existence of the disappeared. For instance, domestic photos are accompanied by ordinary objects of the disappeared, cherished, and used. In short, the museum movingly portrays the material dimensions of the experience of disappearance. Since most of the persons named at the museum were last seen in the military fortress of Los Cabitos, most probably their personal objects displayed at the Museo de la Memoria are all what is left from them. In this affective context, the work that the handwriting text does is striking. Here, I return to Pablo Gerardo's class notebook. It is an object that, to use Barthes' often quoted notion of the punctum, pricks me. Pablo Gerardo's handwriting is, in Barthes' words, the element which rises from the scene, shoots out like an arrow and pierces me, end quote. His unsteady lettering, his misspellings, his grammatical errors, his playful drawings speak to my own childhood when I also engaged as anybody else, these handwriting exercises of discovery, creativity, and joy, but also of discipline and responsibility. My notebooks were my personal archives of these exercises of cell-making through handwriting. The second piece corresponds to an anguished message sent by a disappeared young person to his mother. His name was Archimedes Ascarza, and he was a university student. In the message, he confirms that he is detained at the military base of Los Cabitos and asks for urgent help. The victim has been taken from his home by a military patrol during the curfew and somehow was able to smuggle the note away. But the handwriting piece was the last thing his family knew about him. He was never seen again. Written on a small piece of coated food paper for sugar, this hurried handwriting text is the last visible sight of a person who, on the threshold of life and death, managed to leave this indictment against state terror. It was written in a moment of danger. What is the work of these two pieces of handwriting in the endeavor of truth-telling? First, they bear witness to the life and blood and flesh of people vanished by the state. Handwriting bears the traces of bodily performance, and as such, it is a signature of the uniqueness of being of anyone initiated in the art of writing. Second, handwriting embodies at one and the same time the most personal aspect of the self and the most public. No two people have the same handwriting. Unlike the like the fingerprints, it's distinctive of the person. Third, even if it copies what has already been inscribed many times before, handwriting is continually inventive and singular. In this sense, the two pieces of handwriting at the Subaltern Museum for the Disappeared resist the rhetorical operation through which the self is disembodied to become text in the official projects of truth-making, such as the CBR. If in the CBR project, bodies become text, in the Subaltern Museum, by contrast, the two pieces of handwriting become fragments of disappeared bodies. Allow me to share with you one last ethnographic scene, this time in Mexico. September 26 of 2014, 43 student activists from the Rural Teaching Training School, Raúl Isidro Burgos, were disappeared in the Mexican state of Guerrero after being attacked by local, state, and federal police in the town of Iguala. These students, mostly in their early 20s, had traveled to Iguala to hold a protest against the Mexican government's educational policies. Here, I won't go into details of the ensuing struggle for the truth. What I do want to note, though, is that in the search for the students, the Mexican authorities began to find many mass graves in rural Guerrero, just not the mass grave they were searching for. As these findings began to pile up, the public seemed to lose track of the exact number of graves, which presumably contained the remains of alleged victims of the war on drugs in Mexico. In short, the search for the Ayotzinapa students revealed that practices of forced disappearance, extrajudicial execution, and clandestine disposal of victims' remains, distinctive of the state terror campaigns that plagued the region in the last quarter of the 20th century, remained alive as a technology of rule in the neoliberal era. The story of the 43 rural students of Ayotzinapa has some parallels with the story of the two students displayed at the Museo de la Memoria. They had also been initiated in the art of writing. They were also preparing themselves to initiate others in this art of writing. They also dared to reclaim the promise of equal citizenship, and they were also vanished to never be seen again. The two stories are also similar in that once again in Latin America, relatives were suddenly uprooted from home and thrown into the streets in search for their missing relatives. Images of relatives of the Ayotzinapa students marching in the streets of Mexico evoked images of other relatives marching in the streets of Latin America in search of for their disappeared during the counterinsurgency campaigns of the last quarter of the 20th century. Yet, while practices of political terror in their mechanical repetition bring still images back from the past, the contemporary response to them has been new in several respects. Since my times as a professional human rights activist in Peru between the late 1980s and early 2000s, I never saw the kind of response that the disappearance of the 43 students triggered in Mexico and elsewhere. Under the banner, fue el Estado, it was the state. Thousands of mostly young people went to the streets to denounce these practices of terror and demand the return alive of the disappeared. For my purposes here, I won't go into details analyzing the whys of this response, and I will limit myself to highlight the handwriting in it. Hurriedly drawn in improvised pieces of paper or cardboard, handwritten picket signs, voice slogans, some old and others new, which converge in one old urgent demand. ¿Dónde están? Where are they? In other words, while denouncing the state, fue el Estado, people handwrote their demands to the state institutions to account for the disappeared. Here, the handwriting text speaks truth to power. It becomes a vehicle of truth-telling. These images bring together protest. These images that bring together protest, the street, handwriting, and truth-telling evoke images of what John Dewey calls the public. For him, the public is a confederation of bodies pulled together, not so much by choice. A public for him is not a voluntary association, as by a shared experience of harm that over time coalesces into a problem. Dewey makes clear that a public does not pre-exist its particular problem, but emerges in response to it. The experience of broad solidarity with the relatives of the Ayotzinapa students shows that a confederation of bodies constituting a public in response to a shared experience of harm is not comprised just by those directly harmed. A public can coalesce around the problem of truth-telling, of speaking truth to power and communicating their active intolerance against state terror. In conclusion, handwriting is a central component of anthropological practice. While in the field we jot notes attempting to capture fleeting moments in everyday life, then write field notes and keep those jottings and field notes in journals, which become our archives. Anthropologists have been reflecting about these writing practices, but they have not paid sustained attention to the presence of handwriting in aftermaths of mass violence as subaltern means for indicting state terror and disrupting state-sponsored projects of governing this aftermath. From some time now, I have been thinking that in the attempt to devise languages of pain by which anthropology might be crafted as a textual body on which pain is written, we might also find inspiration in the practice of handwriting, both in its temporality and embodiment. Handwriting evokes simultaneously senses of provisionality and steadiness, hurriedness, intimacy, publicness, movement, physicality, and bodily connection to life. An anthropology of the disappeared in Latin America might thus, on the one hand, take a cue from handwriting to think about its urgency to respond to the ever-threatening presence of state terror. On the other hand, it might also refocus its attention on the bodily experience of mourning by being awake to those fleeting moments of transfiguration when the relatives of the disappeared find a material sign of the missing, perhaps a thread of clothing, perhaps a piece of handwriting, perhaps a bone or a fragment of a bone, and the hyperbolic uncertainty of the disappearance gives way to a fleeting possibility of mourning. Perhaps it's him, only to move forward towards a new search until the next sign is found. Fragmentary, subjunctive, nomadic mourning that does not evacuate the material world from its work. In attending to this double temporality of the experience of violence in the everyday life of the oppressed, I came to think that perhaps the task of anthropology is not so much about writing the aftermath as it is about handwriting the aftermath. Thank you.
Thank you. That was it's an amazing way to think through the relationship between the large numbers and the repairs of state and the repairs of family, and a different way to think the public and how we might constitute new communities around repair. So thank you very much. We are thrilled that Julia has joined us. And again, apologies, Julia, to you for forgetting that the clocks changed in the US this past weekend. We're so pleased to have you with us. Dr. Julia Vibach is a departmental lecturer in African Studies at the African Studies Center of Oxford University. Her research focuses on transitional justice, memorialization, trauma, and witnessing after mass atrocities. She is also interested in critical theory, research ethics, which we've also had a peek at in Dr. Rojas-Perez's presentation as well, thought of what anthropology is, and methodologies. Her recent project, Atrocities Archives, The Remnants of Transitional Justice in Rwanda, adopts a comparative methodology to critically explore how Rwanda's Gacaca courts in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda produce and affirm particular discourses of peace, politics, and trauma. Julia, thank you again for joining us. And for our guest, as noted earlier, if you can start posing questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them after Julia speaks.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for the kind introduction and the opportunity today to take you on to a journey to Rwanda's genocide memorials and an exploration of the entanglement of memory, ritual practice, human remains, and place. I will now try to share my PowerPoint with you, if you just bear with me for a second. Can you all see that okay? Bridget, can you see the PowerPoint?
Looks great.
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, fantastic. So I have to apologize in advance for my really rough voice. And, if I start coughing, I have pollen asthma, and the pollen at the moment in the UK are quite bad already, which means also spring is coming, so which is nice. But at the moment, I'm struggling a little bit. So apologies for that. So as I mentioned before, I want to take you onto a journey to Rwanda's genocide memorials today to discuss how survivors, through the practice of caretaking, negotiate absence presence at Rwanda's genocide memorials. So obviously some of the content here that I will cover is difficult content because precisely I will deal with dead bodies and also human remains. However, I will give content warning when showing the few photos of bodies and human remains. Throughout, I will try, where appropriate, to talk of bodies rather than of human remains, simply because, or importantly, perhaps better to say, because survivors themselves refer to bodies rather than remains when they talk about their dead loved ones, which refers really to survivors giving the bodies back the dignity that they lost in their death. As such, I have been working with survivors of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, and in my research, I took a victims approach. And also I understood violence as an experience, which meant I did not go into the field with ready-made assumptions. What I present today is based on extensive fieldwork in Rwanda since 2011 and ongoing. So the main bulk of what I'm going to talk about today has been published last year in 2020 in the Journal of Critical African Studies under the title Mediating Absence Presence at Rwanda's Genocide Memorials of Caretaking, Memory and Proximity to the Dead. So I would like to start really with a brief exploration of some key concepts in order to better situate my research in current debates. And here in particularly, I want to focus briefly on three key terms, which are memorials, memory, and the effective force of human remains. So I want to understand memorials in line with the work of Madrell and Sidaway as deathscapes. The concept of deathscapes really allows us to see memorials at the intersection of public, political, and personal sphere. And that is in particular important in the context of Rwanda, which is the very politicized context, and the scholarship on Rwandan memorialization often sees memorials merely as politicized tools of the government to pursue their own power and legitimacy. So I want to argue here that we can or should see memorials really as both a political site of political contestation, but at the same time also as a place of mourning and meaning making for individuals. Second, I understand memory in line with Lambeck's anthropological work as a function of relationships. So this really links nicely to issues around personhood, narratives, and the moral obligation to the dead, as I have argued elsewhere. So the moral obligation really to remember the dead into the community of the living. So third, I want to see or really emphasize the effective force of human remains and see human remains in line with Fontaine and Pinay's work as materialities of belongings. So this is important again in the context of the scholarship on Rwanda, because it goes beyond an instrumentalist view that is dominant in the scholarship on Rwanda, that sees the human remains as mere evidence and as a tool for the Rwandan government to evidence that what happened was genocide, and which is used to really keep the genocide alive, which helps the pursuit of power for the government. So the argument goes. So next, I want to talk a bit more about the practice of caretaking in the context of the absence, presence of the dead. So perhaps here the best is to actually go a step back and start with the genocide itself and the brutality, really the level of violence that was inflicted on the victims. So Bloch and Perry talk about bad death in the context where death doesn't occur naturally and sort of disrupts the linear flow of birth, life, and death. So we can see that this happened obviously in Rwanda by through the extremity of the violence that was inflicted on the Tutsi bodies. And in Kinyarwanda, there is the word Bapfuye Nabi for that, to describe this kind of bad death. And I want to argue in line with Douglas that such kind of death requires ritual management, which is here the practice of caretaking. So bad death destroys and disrupts how bodies and persons are constituted. And the immense suffering of people during the genocide and how bodies were humiliated ante and post-mortem resonates with Fontaine's idea in the context of Zimbabwe of a second violence that interrupts not only how personhood is constituted, but also how social processes of funeral rites and commemoration are carried out. And as Meyer and Fontaine in a special issue on human remains in the Critical African Studies Journal assert, the treatment and degradation of bodies ante and post-mortem points to the need to consider violence and the role of the body placed therein within, I quote, continuous, coherent necropolitical frameworks of meaning across arbitrary or imposed distinctions between life and death. And that, I think, is really important to bear in mind when we move on to talk about absence presence, and when we want to understand really the motivations and underlying reasons why survivors have chosen to pledge their lives to the care of the dead at memorial sites in Rwanda. So in the face of the tremendous loss, the absent presence of those who perished features dominantly in the lives of survivors, and they need to contend with how to manage this absence. So Madrill in her work on mourning defines absence presence as making sense of the physical absence, but the emotional and spiritual presence of the dead. And in the paper, I talk much more about the spiritual and cosmological world and the interference into the life of the livings, which I won't be able to do here. But I argue that the dead bodies and human remains facilitate the presence of those who died, and that the practice of caretaking helps survivors to navigate loss and grief. In short, it is a form of mourning. So what is caretaking? So caretaking it involves in particular the regular cleaning and preserving of dead bodies and human remains. But caretaking, as I define it, also involves gifting and caring for the site, attending to flower beds, keeping the grounds clean and tidying and decorating the insides of the memorial with the few personal belongings of the dead that survivors were able to recover from their destroyed houses. Caretaking, I argue, helps survivors to continue bonds with the deceased. And in this context, drawing again on Madrill's work, argues, I quote, in addition to communication, caring for each other is an inherent characteristic of positive relationships, And care and continuity of care is another important performative dimension. After death, care of graves, shrines, etc. is a common form of continuing bonds in the context of cemeteries and here memorial sites. So caring for the dead is therefore an essential part of individual mourning and expressed, in some cases at least, in the washing and preserving of bones at Rwanda's memorial sites. So I want to now show you a specific memorial, and this is a content warning as well as some human remains in the background on the photographs. And I would please ask you not to take any photos or screenshots of these memorials, please. So this is the Shahidna Memorial in the south of Rwanda that you can see here on the pictures. And the left-hand side, the picture depicts the entrance to the memorial. You can see how nicely tidied it is, the flower beds at the side, and the entrance to the tomb where really the caretaking takes place, so the cleaning and preserving of the remains that are found. And you can see here in the picture on the right-hand side, in the blue bucket, remains that were just discovered by Jean, the caretaker there, who I met several times, who he was preparing to be buried in the coffins. So, and as you can also see at the outside bit, at the entrance of the tomb, the photographs that survivors were able to retrieve and have put here in order to remind of those who perished. And I will come back to the specific features at a later point in the presentation. So now I want to move on to talk about what I coin place-bound proximity. So first of all, we need to keep in mind that memorial sites are important material places of mourning and remembering. This coalesces with the significance of a sense of proximity and closeness animated by the presence of the dead bodies and remains, as recounted in many of my interviews. So here, Pauline, one of the female survivors, says, the first 9 years were very hard for me. For all the time I stayed with a friend, I'm the only one left. My kids and my husband are buried here at the Kinansi Memorial. I feel relief when I come here to visit them. There was a time where they couldn't find his body, so her husband's body, but now he's here in the memorial. And then she says, I couldn't keep walking, living, surviving without knowing he is close. In a similar vein, Aline, in one of the focus group discussions that I conducted with female survivors, emphasized the memorial is a place to mourn and to put flowers. It can be a relief being there. It is a connection to the dead. It is a place to think about value and also to reflect on one's own role, for example, when it was not possible to save someone. I want to argue here that memorials are a last resting place, and the burials of loved ones at the sites become place-bound, restructuring a new sense of belonging. The memorial manifests a place-bound proximity precisely because of the proximity survivors feel to their loved ones at those sites. As Pauline said, I couldn't keep walking, living, surviving without knowing he is close. The memorials enable survivors to not only retain relations to the dead, but also to normalize these rather troubling aspects of their relations, as expressed in Aline's account, Acknowledgement, of her inability to save her loved ones. Others, contrary to Aline and Pauline here, haven't found the remains of their loved ones yet. And this is particularly difficult for survivors to deal with. This has been described by Turner and Gannap in the anthropological work as a liminal phase, and we know a lot about this liminality as well in the context of the disappeared in the context of Latin American crimes. So survivors in interviews underscored the importance of having a tangible site to go to and mourn their loved ones, a place where they feel close to them, knowing that their bodies are actually there. So burials can be understood then as a means of purification, and burials allow, according to Turner and Gannap, a post-liminal phase where the body is remembered into society when confined to the burial place. So the local Gacaca courts in Rwanda and the testimonies of defendants revealed the whereabouts of many remains, and that's one of the major positive outcomes for survivors, at least of these community courts. And some memorials even had not sealed the mass graves, hoping that Gacaca would help find bodies. So burials become place-bound then, reconstructing a sense of belonging that is territorially circumscribed. So here another content warning. One of the pictures here in the bottom right shows that body, and I will explain in a minute why that is. So we can compare some of the efforts here to actually create a home for the dead as part of this place-bound proximity. And I argue here that for survivors decorate and basically try to construct a home for the dead where the survivors themselves can come home to be with the dead. So it's really an attempt to transform the massacre sites into one of peace for the souls of the dead loved ones. And we can see similar efforts at the Potocari Memorial Site in Srebrenica, where survivors sought to transform the place of anguish into one of peace for the souls of the dead loved ones. And here I'm referring to the work of Sarah Wagner, who has spoken, I think, at the last panel in this series. So the few survivors of Shahidna here cleared the stains of atrocity and placed identity markers to, in Wagner's work, tabulate loss and keep the memory of those who perished. So inside the ossuary, survivors have placed numerous coffins, as you can see in the picture on the bottom, and crosses with names on them. So that's the same Shahidna memorial I referred to earlier. And in one of the tombs, on one end of the tomb, entirely preserved dead bodies sleep, as survivors say, on shelters. So in one of those is a woman, so the body you can see here. And this woman rests there with the long hair, wearing a colorfully striped jumper. And Jean, the caretaker, told me that her name is Dafrose, and he talked here in the presence of her. She was his neighbor and a teacher in his village. And he continued saying to me that before they killed her, they took her baby from her, cut off its head and brought it back to her. And then he continued saying that she rests in peace here now and I can take care of her. So I argue that the smaller rural memorial sites bear the texture of home through the careful decoration of the space and the way they are bound up with the struggle to maintain relations to those who perished. And the material objects, such as photographs and personal belongings of the dead, materialize an attempt to re-evoke the identity of the dead. And you can see that here in the other picture on the top, which is taken from the Gisenyi Memorial near Lake Kivu in Rwanda. So drawing again on Madrell's work, they are means of embodying, I quote, and enacting hope, care, and communication on the part of the bereaved, whilst at the same time presenting markers of relations to the dead. So I argue here that the photographs and personal belongings are identity markers that help retain the connection to the dead, rather than they are an expression of a globalized way of commemorating human rights violations, which also works a lot with the display of photographs and belongings. And we have seen that as well in the presentation earlier in the museum, that also worked with photographs and some personal belongings such as shoes. So next I would like to talk more about the link between caretaking, very briefly here, imagination and the state-led exhumations that also took place in Rwanda in a very particular fashion. So caretaking is linked here to the untangling of the bodies of genocide victims in the process of exhumations that have taken place over the last decade in Rwanda. So Meyer in her anthropological work describes how the structure of intact skeletons is disentangled and how belongings, clothes, and even human tissue are painstakingly separated from one another so that what remains is an anonymous collective of human remains that do not bear any marks of individuality. And then those remains are buried in coffins according to the body parts. So yet the caretakers imagine how those remains looked like as real people and imagine the faces and traits of their loved ones they believe are amongst those remains they care for. When saying, for example, in interviews, when I work here, I imagine how they look like, or I see them as real people. This point is also aptly demonstrated by Jean I talked about earlier, and the way he talks about the dead body on the photograph, his neighbor Dafrose, he takes care of now. So I argue here that the caretaking of remains is a work that transforms the anonymity of the remains into individual human beings. The uncertainty of whether the bones being washed are in fact those of the deceased is projected onto the remains and bodies and reimagined as the ones that perished. Caretaking therefore imagines the deceased through the care of their corporeal remains they have left or that were left, and the world of the living so that their absence is transformed into presence. They are given back an identity in the face of a collective mass of bones and remains. I come now to the last slide. It is through imagination and work on the dead bodies, the practice of caretaking, that the past and the devalued worth of the dead can be reversed symbolically. This creative practice can be at odds with the official discourse on the meaning and purposes of commemorating and remembering the dead. Even though survivors often agree with the official view on the exposure of human remains as a crucial means of evidencing that the genocide really happened, the bodies have a deeply emotional, affective force for survivors that transcends such notions of evidence and political consciousness. One such ambiguity between state and microprocesses lies in the very meaning of caretaking. Survivors engage in future making through the effective force of their human remains. Imagination provoked by caretaking is a process that follows on from the more archaeological state-led process of recovery and exhumation of bones. And in this process, as I said before, all forms of identity of the bones, such as clothes, ID cards, personal belongings, and even human tissue are disentangled. And at the end of this collective process is a mass of bones that imply a vast dead, one in which the specific detail and texture of the life in which these bones were once embedded is obscured. So importantly, caretaking as a form of ritual management, as I argue, is a micro-level personalized response to this very state-led process. Caretakers in the intimate space of the memorial tombs reimagine the remains as real persons and thereby give them back an identity in the face of this collective mass of bones. The careful washing of remains, but also the tender decoration, cleaning, and tending to the memorial sites can be interpreted alongside survivors' demands, again at the Botticelli Memorial, for, as Wagner in her work argues, and I quote, a reordering response of their own, one that seeks to piece back together bodies, lives, memories, homes, and landscapes. So in piecing back together bodies, identities, and lives, the identity markers left at random memorials gain particular significance and form an important aspect of how memorials animate feelings of coming home to the dead. To some extent, then, the RPF's necropolitics creates quite an unstable but individualized and emotional-laden memory work on the micro level. Ultimately, the practice of caretaking extends survivor space to personally make meaning of loss and to mediate between absence and presence. Through the ritualized practice of caretaking, survivors not only attempt to rebuild themselves in the wake of loss and grief, but also struggle to maintain the partial presence of the dead and to reconfigure relationships with their loved ones. Memory, as suggested by Vibach, becomes a practice that entails a moral obligation to remember the dead into the everyday of the living. This points really to the difficulty to couch memory and memorials into a framework of reconciliation when not the relationship to the perpetrator is at the forefront of remembering, but memory as a moral practice towards the self and towards lost relations to dead loved ones. The analysis of the meaning of place and of its connectivity to caretaking illustrates how the oft-cited notions of healing or reconciliation that animate transitional justice discourses can seem misleading and fundamentally neglect how remembered violence matters and masks the lives of survivors. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Julia. Right now, we have two really excellent questions in the audience Q&A. We wanted to take just a minute or two to initiate a conversation among Diane and I's organizers in Isaias and Julia's presentations, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So if there are more of you who'd like to pose questions, please enter them in the Q&A. And until then, I see that there are two there, and we will get to both of those. In the first instance, I wanted to ask a question, and it's one that I struggled with in my work, which was looking at a museum in Ethiopia that was built by survivors and families of the dead from the Red Terror. But as a museum, right, it was also built for this imagined visitor in the future. And it's one of the difficult pieces to anticipate in building a formal memorial or a museum to difficult past is to whom is this offering for? And you've both shown, I think, really important ways in which the for whom is this for lives with and sort of is built upon the experience of survivors. And they're very private, very, handwritten or lovingly washed remains, their attentiveness to detail. And I guess one of the things I wanted to ask both of you is the process, how you understand, and Isaias, I think you got to it a little bit more in that concept of the public, but how you understand the, whether you would call it a translation from individual mourning or a shift in register from micro to some sort of, but the engagement with the public out of sites of mourning, which is the question of, it's the question of politics and what role does mourning play in creating new constituencies or sites of engagement?
Wants to start, Julia?
Yeah, Isaias, why don't you go ahead? You can start, and then we'll turn to Julia.
Okay. It's indeed it's a very complex question actually that I don't think has a straightforward answer. What I see here, as you are suggesting, is this tension between the politics of mourning versus the ethics of mourning, right? So this broader picture that has to do with society at large, the political community, etc., with the the individual personal experience, right? So both are connected, but that connection is not straightforward. Yeah, it's a political issue in itself, to establish that kind of connection. And in Peru, for instance, which of course is the case that I know, because I'm Peruvian and I did my work there. despite the fact that the several, attempted, to build a discourse based on the idea of victimhood, that would include, everybody, the death of everybody else, right? Like, as depicting this episode of violence as a tragedy, as a national tragedy. There is no, heroes in this war. It has been just, the collapse of our, solidarities, etc. And our death are the death of everybody else, right? They are our death. That was the kind of discourse that at least, some members of the Truth Commission in Peru wanted to articulate, as an inclusive discourse. But of course, that attempt was in itself a political attempt that was contested, by other, sectors of society, right? The armed forces, immediately said, well, not every death are ours, because they are, death that are, from the Shining Path, etc. Those were, the aggressors against the society. So these tensions, around the question of belonging are still, very much in place, until nowadays. It's already more than 20 years. It's going to be about 20 years, the Truth Commission and exhumations. So what I would say is that, it depends on context. In Peru, still, there is this struggle as to, how to bring, these different victims, finally into the same framework, so we can, be able finally to mourn as society and move forward, right? Whereas, in other places, like that's why I try to make this contrast with the Mexican case, because it was really interesting for me, to see how the whole society, almost the whole society, the vast majority, Mexicans reacted, against the disappearance of these 43 students. So there was some kind of, of emergence from within, the energies of the society itself, to try to establish this framework in which, all these victims are ours, and to tell, to speak truth to power, saying, well, we are not going to accept this from happening, again, and that they need to be back, right? So again, that it seems it's a tension that needs to be, evaluated and according to context, and it might actually change, over time as well, right? So it's an open question, actually.
Yeah. And Julia, one of the challenges with the way that you've approached Rwandan memorials against the grain of sort of the use value of the genocide to the state is that it seems almost impossible to say that there's a politics of someone naming the bones as a way to mourn and love someone who's gone. And I wonder if that's where the strength of the political move is that it would be very hard. It's such depth of sorrow and care in that act.
Yeah, I think, Bridget, here it's really important to distinguish between the political purpose of remains and the politics of mourning and the individual mourning. So, and I think the concept of deathscapes really helps to illuminate that this ambivalences can basically live together at one particular site, as the inside and the outside of a particular place, and you only really get to see the inside when you really look for it, right? But I think it is important to acknowledge that obviously the memorials are part of these politics of mourning and commemoration. I haven't talked about the actual politics of commemoration in Rwanda, which is big, between April and July. We have a national mourning week where the government organizes all these events and ceremonies to remember the victims, and they all follow a very specific guideline and script. It's a scripted mourning. But I think what I want to try to show in my work is that we need to look underneath this scripts as well, And then we find a very different sort of landscape of mourning and human remains that suddenly are reimagined as the living, and an attempt to respond to the political aspect of the mourning and the disentangling of bodies and piecing back together these lives at the very places. And I think that is something that has been not looked at enough and understood enough. And I hope that with my work, I can, make a start and encourage to look more at these individual sides. And I think this is why I found it also fascinating to hear about the handwriting Isaias was talking about earlier. Almost as the handwriting as such is a material object that extends the personhood of the deceased. And the same here, we have human remains, dead bodies that extend the personhood of those who they used to be in their lives. So I think that is a very interesting comparison, and perhaps we can talk a bit more about how we could see handwriting and dead bodies in a similar way and what kind of language they speak.
Yeah. Diane, did you want to?
I'm looking at our questions and realizing our time. We have some wonderful questions. So I think that I would like to defer actually to some of our attendees who have put some real time and thought into some conversations, which we will have now in these remaining 15 or so minutes left. So maybe if you want to facilitate those questions, Bridget, and then.
Yeah, why don't I help point us to do like 3 at a time, and then the two of you can kind of think through your responses. There's one, Julia, asking about your use of the term liminality, and if you could talk a little bit more about how you use that in your work. There's another from Ridwan Musaj, who's asking about beyond mourning, right? This mourning is screaming to be heard. The dead, the bodies are not merely sets of human remains. There's so much more. And thinking about, there's a sense in which mourning in some ways closes down histories of violence. And so it would be good to hear you speak about not only the expansiveness of what mourning does, but also the risks that it poses, right? So to take your propositions and also see them from the other side on the politics of violence. And then there's one very specific question, Julia, for you on where did the illustrations, the photographs come from in your work? So if you could engage with those questions, and then I'll get the next batch ready.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bridget. These are really complex questions. Let me try to start answering those. So liminality really is a term that was used first by Turner and Gannett to describe burial rites or passage of rite of passage. And the idea behind liminality is, and as I said in the presentation, it comes particularly from the South American context and the disappeared, is the fact when you cannot either find the body because the body is disappeared, or in the case of Rwanda, the location of mass graves was not disclosed by the perpetrators, so that a proper burial cannot take place. So this is when a liminal status basically occurs, or the liminality is defined by this in-between state where you presume someone is dead, but you can't really lay that person to rest. And I think we don't even need to look at the context of mass violence, where it is obviously more pronounced, but also in national context, when bodies aren't found, there is always this question mark, what happened around that. So, and in that way, once the body is found, and in Rwanda, that was particularly the case to the localized gacaca courts, that were put in place by the government after the genocide, better to say, in 2002, in order to address the thousands and thousands of defendants in prisons, one aspect of these courts were that the perpetrators could ask for forgiveness and basically disclose the whereabouts of bodies. So that was for survivors, Tutsi survivors, extremely important because that enabled them to overcome this liminal state and to bury the bodies at the memorials or at their homesteads, depending on what they wanted at that point. So this is how I use liminality in my work. So perhaps the question on the photographs, so the work that what I use here is the first slide and the last slide are traditional Imigongo artwork that you can, which is Rwanda, very famous in Rwanda. And the other ones are all work from Rwandan artists that are in the presentation. You know, the art scene in Rwanda is really developing, and it's fantastic to see all these young artists engaging with the past in these creative ways. So then there was a question about the mourning again and the bodies. So I think I have talked already answering Bridget's question about the politics of mourning and the translation from the micro to the public, that mourning needs to be distinguished between perhaps the actors or the agents who are involved in it. And when I talk about survivors, I mean the micro processes of mourning at the memorial sites. So, and I think the bodies as such, they do mourn, right? So they are not only tools, and it's exactly or precisely what I want to show, that they're not just tools of remembering, but the human remains of the bodies are an extension of the personhood that they once preoccupied, right? So this is the language that they are speaking. And I think particularly in the case of Rwanda, the violence is also inscribed onto the bodies. So the texture of violence is actually on those bodies. So I'm not quite sure that in the case here, the history of violence basically is silenced through the mourning of the remains. To the contrary, I think it's actually written onto them and really in the open and presented. But obviously the risk of mourning in that way also, we need to think about, particularly when we talk about the politics of mourning, and Isaias has mentioned that earlier, you know, that mourning and the politics of mourning creates victimhood and hierarchies of victimhood. And the question obviously is who is remembered and who is mourned, you know, and whose life is seen as worth being mourned, referring here also to the work of Judith Butler. So I think that are risks that need to be taken in account.
Yeah. Isaias.
Great, thank you. The question of the risks of mourning, I think it's an excellent question because, you know, it helps us clarify, you know, what I think the conversation is here, in the sense that Julia was mentioning earlier that in some cases in Rwanda, these kinds of killings, you know, these kinds of deaths, you know, are considered, you know, bad death, right? And then, you know, describes this whole, you know, emerging ritual of caretaking that seems to be responding to something else that is not, you know, necessarily just, you know, bad death. What I would say is that, you know, bad death, as Hertz, you know, describes and defines the thing, is a cultural category that is already there, that there are, you know, beyond this mass, beyond these mass killings in every society, there are forms of death that are, you know, considered, conceptualized as bad death. In Peru, for instance, suicide, and I tell this story, you know, in my book. So suicide, you know, is a case of bad death, and as a cultural category, there are, you know, certain prescriptions, you know, to deal with these, you know, instances of bad death, right? But in the case of these massacres and disappearances, etc., they are not. Andean people do not categorize this as bad death. There is no category for these, you know, kinds of killings. They are outside, you know, what was conceived as you know, disagreements in cultural forms, you know, in Andean society, right? So And in my book also, I tell the story of how, for instance, an Andean community that suffered the killing of 69 people, small community, they didn't have words, to call, to name that event. And then they only, learned how to call, how to refer to that event when modern languages, came and introduced the notion of genocide. Now these Andean communities are using genocide but genocide was not before in their cultural, imaginations, in their cultural practices. But then, they then are, these Andean, communities, the mothers of disappeared, etc., are developing, this task. They are confronting, they are engaging of task of remaking their world and reinventing their world, right? So in that sense, they are, of course, trying to see how to domesticate, this event, how to live with this event, right? And in that effort, they are developing, their forms of mourning. They are reinventing mourning, so to say. Okay, this, reinvented mourning combines both, these politics of mourning, necessarily, entails this politics of mournings, as well as these new forms of engagement, with the absent present, as Julia nicely put it, right? That's precisely what I attempted, to explain with the handwriting, in the museum, right? It's simultaneously the presence of this, individual of whom, we have this, even, not just, no clothing, it's the handwriting itself, right? So it was this individual, right? It's the only, bodily remain that is there. But simultaneously, this handwriting is making this, claim about, this political claim about the violence that has been, visited upon these peoples and the families, etc., right? So I totally understand, this the risk of thinking of mourning as something that is, completed, that's something that is already in the past. But at least, particularly in the case of the mothers of disappeared, not only in Peru, but elsewhere in Latin America, the past is not, completed. And the task of mourning, remains, and it's both, personal, intimate, as well as political. And this is why, these processes that state institutions, such as truth commissions, exhumations themselves, etc., are attempting to bring it to a close, are, contested by these families. So there is a risk, but in any case, there's a risk that these families and survivors are taking, in order to remake, their worlds, in the aftermath of these atrocities.
So we have a bunch more questions. I'll just sort of give you a sense of the horizon of what they are. And then I want to hone in on one because it's really what this series has focused on. Julia, there's one question for you about the link between identification and bodies from Susanna, who spoke on our last panel. And maybe identification doesn't exhaust the vocabularies of dignity for the dead. There was another question about comparative and sort of different processes for what might be a proper burial, and how across cultural differences, the proper might come into to speak with each other. And another question around how perpetrators appear among the dead, or in relation to. But then there is one question that floated across two different proposals here. And this is what I wanted to ask you both to say as kind of a final remark, specifically about bones, which is really what brought us together in the series of panels. And I think is really interesting here because we have one example that is so much about the bones and caring for them, and another where we have artifacts that are almost more living, like in the sense of handwriting, that it was something carved by an individual, or, even the signature that represents the individual. And so on those, and this is a question that came in relation to Bosnia as well, and Potocari at the Srebrenica Memorial there. He said their bones aren't shown, and in fact, they wouldn't be shown given cultural sensitivities. and asking what difference does it make if what's on display are physical remains or if they are sort of handwritten remains. So that's the one I wanted to ask if you could both conclude with us. And it says, am I correct? There are no human remains shown at that, the museum that you spoke of.
Perhaps, Julia, you want to start or?
Yeah, Julia?
You want to start or?
Oh, no, you go ahead, Sarah. That's okay.
Okay. So bones, it's a central question, because that's precisely one of the questions I had for Julia as well. In the case of Peru, bones belong, to the state. So no private, citizens can have, the remains of, any deaf person, right? So they belong to the state, and they have to be, of course, somehow, entrusted to the families. The families then bury, these bones, and then, go with the, mourning rituals, etc. But it wouldn't be, according to legal, arrangements in Peru, wouldn't be possible for these, women, for these mothers of the disappeared, for instance, to display, human bones in their museums or in their memorials. Because, the state, it doesn't allow, the sovereignty over the bones, it's on the state. Okay, so the state, the bones have to be, in specific, sites, already assigned by law, right? So that's, a difference I was, noticing with the Rwandan case. And the second thing, in which I might be wrong, Julia, but then you clarified to me this, but not all these memorials are state sponsored, right? It's a private and communal initiatives that are, in charge or are possessors of the bones, as far as I understand, right? So that would be, a major difference, more in the legal terms, right? In secondly, there is also this cultural, idea, and here I would like to address, this question about the cultural differences. Perhaps because it's a Catholic, after colonial after a colonial encounter, these societies have become, Catholic societies. There is this notion that bones, material remains, have to be buried, right, in order to move on, in the process of mourning, right? And then, of course, this whole process of rituals, every year, visit, to the cemeteries, etc., or masses, to remember the souls. Basically, it's the soul rather than the material, the material bodies, right? But the question again, in terms of this reinvention of forms of mourning cultural reinvention of mourning that I referred to, earlier, there is also, this question, which I tell in my book as well, about what to do with this, ashes or fragments of incinerated, bones that have been, recovered, from these exhumations, in this, from these, mass graves, right? Where are they, going to be sent eventually? How are they going to be disposed of? And here is where, these mothers of disappear, come and say, okay, we need a place, we need a site of memorial for these bones. So we can, exactly what Julia described, we can visit them, we can, offer them, proper burial. We can, make their presence, felt, right? But that, that kind of memorial does not, presuppose necessarily the display of this, remains, this human remains, but it's more, in the idea of assigning, to these remains a proper, site of burial, right? That can be remembered, etc. Not, like the display to the public. So I would say there are these two different, legal and cultural regimes that seem to be, establishing a kind of difference from the one, Julia is describing in her work. But again, the problems of, like, remaking the world, with the legal and cultural, means available, seems to be, similar in both cases. Okay.
Yeah, and Julia, as a concluding comment.
Yes, thank you, Isaias. I think, like it is absolutely on point to say, that the legal and the cultural regime here at play. And perhaps just to clarify that for the context of Rwanda, because I think this is often actually misunderstood. So whilst the government has basically claims the sovereignty of the bones and the remains, right, in its necropolitics, and has ordered laws. So there's law on memorial that particularly details who's actually allowed to display bones. And actually the interesting thing is that only, so there's 7 national memorial sites in Rwanda, and only in these national memorial sites that are also basically governed by a government body, is the display of remains and bodies actually allowed. So now what we see is that at the rural memorials, where legally it's actually not allowed, right, survivors still have decided to display and the remains. So I mean, they don't talk about display, and I actually don't like the word display, but they say where the body sleeps, so where they have put them to let them sleep, which also sort of signifies this form of liminality, right? Again, in a very different way. So I think that is important to distinguish, and I think that really survivors do. So the attempt of caretaking is an attempt of reclaiming those bodies back from the state, right? Because I mean, survivors are also involved in the exhumations, which Maya in her work calls the survivor exhumers. So they do follow the state guidelines and activities or policies, but at the same time, they have developed their own way of counter narrative or counter text, that they write on to the remains and the bodies. And I think that is really the interesting point here, to see that this is a process that follows on from the forensic exhumation and sort of this legal regime that the government has put in place. And that also leads me then to the identification question. So I think identification is again, it's a forensic term, right? It's a identification is usually made to have at the end like a legal process as well, right? So whilst I think I don't talk much about identification, but about reimagination, right? So this is very different, because actually whether these remains that are cleaned are those of, like the sister, the brother, the daughter, the father, or the husband is unclear. You don't know that, right? But you reimagine them as these persons. And that is what then also gives them back to dignity. And I haven't talked in the presentation about dignity, but do so quite a lot actually in the paper, where I also see this washing and preserving as a form of giving back the dignity. And this speaks to the temporality Isaias was talking about in his presentation, to basically return the clock, to undo what has happened. And the only thing they can do now in the present, because they couldn't save their relatives, is cleaning their bodies, because they died a bad death. And this is in Rwanda is conceptualized culturally as a bad death, the way victims were really humiliated ante and post-mortem. So this is a really important factor, I think, culturally, to situate the meaning of remains and bodies culturally, and then also transporting it further to what does that actually mean in the aftermath of violence, without sort of falling back into a cultural, like seeing culture as stagnation, because that's also something you find in the scholarship that is often say, well, but it's not part of Rwandan culture. Well, culture changes, right? And I think particularly mass atrocity and genocide, there are ruptures, there are big ruptures in societies, texture. And this also means a rupture of culture that can change afterwards. So I think these are all aspects that we need to take into account when we talk about the meaning of remains and mourning them in the aftermath of mass atrocity and genocide.
Thank you both. That was such a rich discussion. I wish we could have had a lot more time with the two of you and together with our audience. Before everyone leaves, I'd also just like to point your attention. We have our final panel of this series coming up on April 14th. And that's on political economy, ethics, and practices of displaying human remains. Until then, and I hope everyone will join us, I'd very much like to thank Jess Burns, who is the woman who helps make all of this possible. She manages all of the back end of our events. My colleague Diane, and of course to our two speakers today for such thoughtful and thought-provoking presentations. So thank you both very much.
Thank you so much. There's never enough time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much again for your invitation and for being part of this, fantastic series.
Thank you.
And I hope that both of you will be able to join us if your schedule permits next time. We were fortunate enough to have our last three panelists present this time. And so we appreciate their presence as well. So thank you so much. And we hope to all be together again in April.